Hello once again, Altered community. I'm the Kelon Guy, and finally back with another Altered TCG video. You know I love to ramble, but I'm planning on keeping this one reasonably short. Promise. I'll have further long-form videos coming soon to run you through all that I've been up to, from looks at the metagame and tournaments, to decks that have been fun to play over the last couple months, but for today, I'm here to talk about removal in Altered TCG, the impact removal has on how the game is played, and then a juicy, on-theme Trial by Frost spoiler in case my voice alone isn't enough to keep you hanging around. I distinctly remember a prevailing narrative in the early Altered meta, post-release of Beyond the Gates, that narrative being that removal is weak in Altered. Removal, for lack of a better definition, just involves the idea of getting rid of things of your opponents. Other games, like Magic the Gathering, that many Altered players have previously played, are chock full of quality removal options from even just 1 mana with hardly any restrictions, and I believe that this preconception of Altered's removal suite being weak currently is largely due to that ease of good removal in other games. Additionally, most characters in Altered get 2 lives, as they can typically be played from reserve, and much of the available removal both doesn't discard the character entirely, and often comes with fleeting itself, so that they're often one-time options. When this isn't the case, like with the card Off You Go, you do get multiple uses, but with heavy restrictions between both what the spell can hit, and the back half of the card when played from reserve will always be cost inefficient. Nevertheless, virtually all competitive decks are playing at least a playset of removal options, and typically, the less flexible that these removal options are, the more likely it is that those decks also make use of additional removal options. So let's take a look at what a solid Sigismar deck, Sigismar being one of the best competitive heroes at the moment, is making use of in terms of removal. We see here 3 copies of Teamwork Training, a spell suited for getting rid of any character with a cost equal to or less than the number of characters you control, which is likely to be a pretty reasonable number when you're playing a token producer hero. This is an incredibly strong spell at just 2 mana and as a common, but isn't entirely enough on its own to give you protection against certain problem strategies. Given that this spell only hits characters, and often only characters that cost a few mana or less, the deck is making use of sticky note seals additionally to get rid of a couple specific problem permanents and other possible large characters. And notably, it's also just a common. But while Teamwork Training suits your optimal strategy, Sticky Note is for the emergencies. Other times, conventional removal spells aren't efficient enough, and that's where we'll get into what I'll call pseudo-removal options. These are things that don't operate as true removal, like with Beauty Sleep or the Sandman. Both of these cards are pretty excellent in both their own factions and in their out-of-faction versions, allowing for strong tempo plays, and are simply fantastic for closing out a game, but they aren't true removal in the sense that if they're played early, the characters that you're targeting will be sticking around for the next turn. So why does any of this matter? Well, the impact of removal as it stands currently is that it vastly reduces the average cost of characters that players want to play in a game of Altered. Removal already has the disadvantage in that it needs to be played after there are targets out for it to hit, and removal typically doesn't come in character form either, with a couple exceptions, so it doesn't threaten to take expeditions. Meanwhile, just putting more stats out does demand answers. Additionally, with the exception of the times that removal is cost efficient, playing more small things means that you will typically be the last player to act, giving you all the information you need about where and when you should be playing things. The times that removal hurts your strategy the most in a game of Altered is when you play something that is both impactful and demands an answer, like a Lyra Festival or a Hydracana, where if those cards stick around on your board, they will make your opponent's life feel very difficult. But there are actually lots of options to remove those things, and they don't feel bad to play whatsoever. In general, the higher the mana cost of the threat, the better the threat feels to remove, as the player playing the expensive cards will typically have to commit much more of their game plan to do so, and they're also very unlikely to have the last action of the afternoon while playing something with a high mana cost. Meanwhile, imagine the feeling of relying on an Off You Go as an answer while playing against a Sigismar. They start the afternoon with a token, which on its own demands an answer. They have a plethora of cheap character options to play, many of which will enable card draw to find even more cheap characters. And the ones that don't do so often just give them another Ortis Recruit token to further complicate things. And if you do find something that costs a couple mana to remove without being inefficient, unless that character has fleeting already, they can simply replay it to win an expedition, and they will feel pretty wonderful about it. So here's where we come to our cool Trial by Frost spoiler. A huge shout out goes to Equinox for letting me reveal an upcoming card from the set due to come out at the end of the month. Let's meet Freeze. Freeze is a disruption spell at 4 cost, 4 from reserve, with the cooldown keyword, which sends itself to reserve exhausted after being played, unlike many removal spells with fleeting, which would send it to discard instead, meaning that Freeze can typically be used more than once. Its effect unconditionally sends a character straight to reserve, also exhausted, meaning that it cannot be played until it is readied the next day. For the most part, this is more of the same as we've seen with current removal. The spell feels great if it goes after something with higher cost than itself, but otherwise doesn't really feel awesome. But the last dynamic I was mentioning before does change, where the card cannot simply be replayed the same turn, which does help for the times that you need to remove a problem low cost like a Katagiran Mage Dancer or an Ortis Attorney. Better yet, if the card was good for you the first time you played it, it's likely to be good again if you can indeed play it again from reserve. Due to its cost, the card it most directly has to be compared with is one that has found its way into many Izmir decklists as a catch-all removal spell, that being Banishing Gate. Banishing Gate has the same cost, discards directly any character or permanent, allowing for no replaying, critically hitting things like Grand Endeavor, for example, that pure character removal cannot. Which means it's often much better than Freeze, but it also does have fleeting, so once it's used, it's gone as well. Let's check out the rare version of Freeze to see if something changes here. Our rare Freeze has exactly the same text, but costs 3 mana when played from hand instead of 4. With the cost change, the card is becoming more efficient, but whether or not it may warrant a rare slot in a deck will depend largely on the critical mana breakpoints that decks will be operating around. And that's going to be largely both metagame dependent, as well as being dependent on the cost breakdown of cards that you're working with for your own game plan. And for those of you who realize that I'm missing a very important dynamic of this card, you are absolutely correct. Sending cards to reserve exhausted is likely to actually be a major upside in the new Trial by Frost set. And we already know that Izmir is a faction looking to benefit off of this. Check out this super sweet synergy between the previously revealed Moth Larva and Freeze. Freeze puts both itself and the character it targets into reserve exhausted, meaning that Moth Larva's condition is met via the playing of a single card. Awesome! A few more effects benefiting from exhausted cards in reserve, and I'd actually be super hyped to set up cool card combinations utilizing Freeze. I will definitely be checking in with all the upcoming Izmir spoilers to see what might be possible here. And then, there's the version of Freeze that I might be the most excited for. It's the Bravos Out of Faction Rare Freeze. Same cost as the Izmir Common, same effect. Specifically, I have high hopes for there being some support of the Ramp archetype in Bravos, which has suffered the most from the removal versus big things is at its best phenomenon that I've been laying out in this video. And in comparison to some of the key Bravos removal options, Freeze has a few distinct advantages. Yes, Mana Reaping and Mana Eruption do remove cards entirely, but otherwise, they both have anti-synergies with the idea of a ramp strategy. Discarding Mana Orbs for Mana Eruption is completely resetting your ideal game plan, and giving them to your opponent, like with Reaping, is often nearly as bad. Again, I'm waiting to see what further support will come out here for the archetype, but Freeze is an exciting option just based on the current removal dynamics. And if exhausted cards in reserve become an upside for Bravos, I'm even more thrilled. Overall, I'm super excited to see what new cards will impact the removal dynamics and resulting reduction of average card cost. As it stands, I love how Altered plays already, but I can't wait for some major shakeups. Trial by Frost will be releasing pretty much everywhere January 31st, and I, for one, love the cold. Until next time, I'm the Kelon Guy. Stay frosty.